We desperately need a coordinated cross-government approach that gives both long-term stability and confidence to the sector.
A competitive UK supply chain is critical in ensuring we have an end-to-end automotive industry to compete with the best.
The automotive industry has specific needs driven by legislation, and I would like to see specific measures for automotive within that industrial policy.
The automotive sector is a key part of the nation's manufacturing.
Righty-ho, there we are. You join them now live, as we say in broadcasting world. And hot off the press, of course, we got this new industrial strategy. It was yesterday. We're going to hear from the Secretary of State later on, which is brilliant. Let me turn, first of all, to Sam Lister, because you're at the heart of all of this. Just kind of give us a sense of where we are, of how important it is from the government perspective and the extent to which the detail is going to be made aware to people soon.
Yeah, so look, thank you, Justin, and I guess others will judge how important and successful they feel it has been, and it's obviously only been 24 hours since we put it out. It is really important for the government and the way the government operates, and its partnership and its long-term partnership in business. And I've done industrial policy over a number of years, and the biggest issue you come across is basically the sort of clarity and consistency of the policy that you are putting out. And if people are not confident that it is going to sustain and that it is going to be a sort of guiding structure to how government makes its decisions and how government interacts with business, then the confidence drains away pretty quickly. And we did find that in 2017 when we had a pretty decent industrial strategy with a lot of engagement, including with colleagues in the room today. But I think everybody felt that as soon as the government faded away, the industrial strategy would fade away, which is roughly what happened. So this time round, we have done a very comprehensive consultation. Great thanks to many in this room who've contributed to that. The fundamental thing we're trying to achieve is driving up business investment. And that is business investment within the UK, that is exports, and that is foreign direct investment into the UK. And you will see in the industrial strategy, it sets out a range of ways in which we are going to make it cheaper, quicker, easier for business to do business. And it is focused on 8 high growth sectors. And I would say, again, we are making some pretty deliberate and quite tough choices. So we have chosen 8 sectors and a set of subsectors within them. They represent basically about 30% of the economy, about 20% of the economy. So we are sort of narrowing in quite quickly. And then you will see, I would hope, in a very consistent and sustained way, government making decisions on the basis of the framework and the choices it is making around sectors, around places, and around markets. So, as an example, the spending review, there's a ton of money put towards research and development. How that money gets allocated will be aligned to the 8 high growth sectors and the subsectors, those cutting edge markets, those technologies, certainly in the auto space, which is picked out as one of the key subsectors within advanced manufacturing. We're looking at a range of R&D initiatives that we want to back over the next 10 years. And then you can sort of look at it from things like access to finance, another big issue that was raised. The British Business Bank will tilt its sort of considerable power and its sort of loan facility towards those sectors and subsectors for the first time. But previously, it would operate in a slightly more agnostic way. And then the flip of that is like how we're thinking about regulation, and we're doing sort of regulatory interventions to help speed things up or sort of alter some of the pressures and profiles that regulation creates to support the growth of business. And then you can look at things on the flip of, like, I guess, some things which probably would not look like terribly pro-growth policy interventions, like the immigration white paper, which doesn't sort of add up as a sort of big growth driver, but it is a very necessary and important sort of set of policies. But things like the sort of constraints on the skilled worker visa, there is a deliberate carve out within that for the 8 high growth sectors. So looking at key occupations that we would need to be able to drive growth in those particular sectors as the key areas of the economy that are going to drive up business investment.
Right, that is a brilliant exposition of what we're looking at. Let me just go down the row, actually, and get you, from your perspectives, each of you, strengths, weaknesses, areas you'd like to see a bit more detail.
I'll take notes.
So starting down at the end.
Yeah, okay. Well, first off, I think we have to welcome it, and we do very much welcome it. I think Johnny Reynolds needs to be congratulated for finally grasping the nettle. I know that Greg Clark's joined us, and we haven't had an industrial strategy since Greg was in office, and then he was obstructed by his own government. I mean, the reality is now we have a government that's very much on our side, is in listening mode, and has listened. So we very much welcome the strategy. There's a lot of very, very good things in there, particularly around energy. I don't think it's enough on energy. I'll come back to that perhaps a little later in the debate. I don't think that meets the objective at all, to be honest with you. I think we've got some serious issues there. And we've got a whole series of things that are being addressed, whether that's planning regulations, opening up the market, trying to address the question of low volume production in the UK, trying to set at least a target of 1.3, 1.5 million vehicles, but no real clear plan about how we're going to get there, what it takes to get there. We're not going to do it with the current footprint of plants in the UK, so we need to attract, and that goes back to the discussion that was had earlier about the Chinese, perhaps. What's our approach going to be to China? How do we do it? How do we support UK supply chains? We're very innovative in the UK. We're fantastic at being world cutting edge, actually, in terms of technology, digital advances, and a whole series of mobility questions are being developed here in the UK, but we're not good at industrialising that. We're not good at utilising the talent that we've got to bring manufacturing to the UK and to retain it in the UK. We often under IP license it and produce it somewhere else. And so that whole question about how we bring supply chains still remains open to us, but there's great things in there. There's some real opportunities in there, and the door's open, and that's probably the most important thing. The door's open, the dialogue will continue.
Okay, we'll just come straight down the row, and then we will get a response. You don't have to respond to every single point that comes up, but anything that then occurs to you that you think you can respond to usefully.
So it was released yesterday, so I slept very well last night, having read it, not for negative reasons, absolutely, because if we stand back on a serious point, we have an industrial strategy, and everyone in this room, I'm guessing, has something to do with automotive or manufacturing. So that's great that we've got that. I think the government and the DBT are in lockstep with industry. So this hasn't been done in isolation, which is, again, excellent. So the formulation of the strategy has been great. I have to congratulate the SMMT as well. I'm not being paid for that, by the way, but Mike and his team represent this audience outstandingly, and I'd have to say probably the best in the industry at doing that. So our voice has been heard, and we've got to thank all the stakeholders for that. Now, it does address key elements: energy, skills, investment in R&D, and CapEx. So that's great news. Devil is in the detail, as always. What I would suggest, to a point that was made by Sam, is that we've got to act quickly, because the industry is changing quickly, the global environment is changing quickly. We cannot lose momentum. So I'd encourage everyone in this room that's got a voice to get it out there, and let's sit together. DBT and the government are listening, so let's seize that opportunity.
Catherine.
Thank you. Yeah, and well done to SMMT for arranging this summit the day after the strategy was launched. Great timing.
They're very good at that.
Yeah, delighted to be here. The Catapult, as some of you may know, and if you don't, I'm happy to chat afterwards, is at the intersection between business and academia and, of course, government. So we are here to help all of the SMMT members and beyond. And we were created in an industrial strategy 2 ago, so 2011. So been around 14 years, but some of our fantastic 6 centres have been around a lot longer than that. And I was thinking about the strategy. We were all obviously not sleeping last night thinking about the strategy. And actually, one of the thoughts I had was a bit like that Aesop's fable about the tortoise and the hare. So obviously, maybe both of those have won. Because the tortoise for me is the fact that there's a lot of structures that were created in the last few industrial strategies that have actually carried on. So obviously the Automotive Council was one of the creations, APC, ATI, I know the aerospace sector pretty well as well. So those all carried on, but obviously congratulations to Sam and the team and the ministers on some of the newer initiatives. They've actually listened to businesses, as Mick has said, you know, the energy intervention and looking at horizontal things. So the advanced manufacturing sector employs about 2.7 million people across the UK. So absolutely one of our strengths. And I'm delighted, I think I've said this to Sam, that advanced manufacturing was at number 1 on the list of 8 sectors. I know that was just because of the letter A, but I do like to see it as an important priority. So we have fantastic centres, all of whom who work in automotive. And for us, really pleased and welcome the announcement about more investment in R&D. So the business I'm in is all about innovation and how we can help companies, how we can help all those important supply chains that Steve and Mick just mentioned. So the other point is, of course, the Advanced Manufacturing Plan is part of the strategy, and of course the Technology Adoption Review, also published yesterday. Some really interesting facts and figures in that about how only a quarter of SMEs are using robotics and the latest innovation, and that's absolutely the sweet spot of where we in the Catapult across the UK can help. The final point for me, and I really, really welcome this, is the big focus on place. And we all know advanced manufacturing, there's a lot in London, in the southeast, but we're all over the UK, and I think that should be really welcomed.
Thank you, Phil.
Okay, I'd echo what has been said previously. We welcome this strategy. I think the duration of it is important. I think that does help cases, our investment cases, when we're pitching within our company for investment in the UK rather than in other plants in Europe or the US. So that duration helps, sets out that long sort of term view. I think it also shows the government has listened. A lot of the feedback that was pushed in has come back front and centre, kind of energy. Whether it's enough, I think we'll discuss later. But in there, I think the research and development and the other funding streams, it's great to see those back in there as well, particularly for automotive. And then it touches on skills and other things that I know were put forward by the industry. I think the place bit is interesting because manufacturing generally doesn't take place in cities, and how that plays out, I certainly need to understand it a little bit better with what was in there and what I quickly scanned through yesterday. And how that support is going to get delivered across the regions as well. But overall, really welcome it.
I'll let you just pick up anything you want to, and then I think we probably ought to drill down specifically on energy, which I'll come back to Steve for. But to take a kind of broad view of what you've just heard, sir.
Yeah. So I think I think we all recognise that the sort of longevity and the sort of sustaining of the strategy is what is most important, and we've got to get on with it quickly, and we've got to keep to the task. I think there are really positive signs in how some of the money, I mean, funding is not everything, and like clearly the sort of fiscal constraints are quite severe, but actually some of those budget allocations in the spending review were deliberately described as 10-year funding allocations, which is putting a really strong signal out to the market that government is going to commit public money and that private investment can come alongside that public money, particularly into sort of cutting edge areas of innovation that actually is not attracting vast quantities of private capital, that those signals are sort of out there and feel long term. On the place bit, I mean, place is a really critical element. I think one of the sort of lessons we drew in reflecting on the sort of a tight fiscal envelope is if you do spread the jam too thinly, it is all just sort of, you lurch into sort of incrementalism. So we have deliberately, there are local growth plans, which are all sort of areas are developing, which are about local improvement and across the economy and the sort of wider sort of society within those sort of regional footprints. Our ask of them is then, what are the sort of nationally significant sectoral contributions that you are making to our sort of global clout and our sort of comparative advantage on the world stage in particular sectoral areas. So you will see in each of those sector plans, they draw out which areas of the country have themselves put forward a particular strength, so that we can be really clear about where we can sort of lean in and help. And there's interesting, I mean, there is quite a lot of content in there, which I acknowledge and hopefully feels sort of coherently sort of structured. One interesting little line in it is about creating a model for investable sites, which is basically where too many investors come into the UK and say, we want to invest a large amount of money, we want to create a load of jobs, we want to come to a particular part of the country where there is a real sort of skills infrastructure that we can sort of bed into, and basically, you know, they get to the plug in the wall and there's no grid connection, and actually the planning controls are going to hold them up for months, if not years, and we've got to have a model that is sort of really ready for that to receive that sort of investment. So we really want to work on stuff like that. And then final quick thing, in terms of the long-term sort of partnership bit, if this is a sort of government task, it is going to fail. It has got to be like a shared endeavour, and Mick's role on the Auto Council, like really valuable for it to be a sort of business and sort of wider bodies, and I would take my hat off to the SMMT for the work that they have been doing. But it has got to be a sort of shared endeavour where we both sort of test and challenge each other. We are accountable for getting this stuff done together. If it only sits in government, apart from anything, government won't get sort of held to task enough, and it will get distracted and sort of world events and whatever else. So I would say, and I'd say when you do that, and noting Greg Clark here, when we have focused in on particular areas and put the sort of structures around them and the government funding and the sort of sustained approach, and you look at something like battery technology, which we did in the last industrial strategy. The Faraday Institute was created as a sort of, as a hub of global expertise in battery technology. The investment was fed into it, and it actually did sustain. And while the Boris Johnson administration did sort of junk industrial strategy, actually there were components of it that really kept going, and they've kept going. They've basically been keeping going for nearly a decade, and they are really showing good returns.
Steve, talk to us about energy and energy costs.
Well, I don't think it's just about automotive. I think energy costs for all of us, whether it's domestic customers or whether it's industrial players, and all sectors of the economy are impacted by this. But it's completely disproportionate to our competitors. It is the number one issue of competitiveness for many of our energy users. And that's a huge challenge. It's not an easy answer to it, but there's a huge challenge that needs to be grasped. And the reality is, while it's welcome, the news on the 2027 position, the 7,000, whoever they may be, businesses that will benefit from it, how deep that goes into the supply chain where there's a real problem, not just with the OEMs. But that's just not going to do it. I mean, that's going to be, depending on volumes, about 15 or 20 euros a vehicle. That's the reality of it. The national insurance hike put 250 euros on your vehicle. So put it into perspective, right? So you've got to do something about the price of energy. If we're going to be competitive, if we're going to be where we need to be on those newly developed technologies, if we're going to be a superpower in terms of battery manufacturing, and we need to do that for auto, but we need to do that for defence, we need to do that for energy supply and security. We need to do that in a number of different ways, but if we're going to do that's a hugely energy intensive sector of the economy. Who's going to come here and establish a gigafactory of the sort of size that we need? Aguatas, we were lucky that didn't go to Spain. We know that. We had the argument about that, and it's going now to Somerset, of course. But who's going to come here with the energy costs as they are? With the costs as and without high volume manufacturing, who are we going to supply? So all of this feeds into a coordinated, comprehensive industrial strategy that's required to support a bigger supply chain, a deeper supply chain that encourages the innovators to invest in manufacturing here in the UK, which creates jobs, which creates growth, which is what I'm interested in, UK manufacturing. I'm not interested in meeting a ZEV mandate by importing 100% electric vehicles, right? That doesn't do anything for us. So the issues around ZEV are still live. They're not really addressed. Very welcome the changes that were made very earlier on. But until we do something about the trajectory, until we do something about demand, we're not going to hit those targets.
Do you think the government gets that at a political level? I know I'll put those things.
I think Department of Business gets it.
Right.
I think Department of Business gets it.
Department of Energy?
I think, well, it's not energy, it's transport.
Yeah.
Department of Transport, I don't think get it. I think they've got a policy objective and there's a real disconnect between some departments and DBT, which in reality picks up the pieces. And we've got a very good relationship with DBT and Johnny and Sarah and others, and the door is open. But the reality is they're reacting to policy initiatives that have been taken in other departments who have not been listening.
But that's why I mentioned energy, because I'm thinking of Ed Miliband, who I talk to regularly on the Today programme. I just wonder whether you think that the politics within the cabinet, in a sense, and within the party might change in a way that is material over the next, whatever it is, 4 years.
Well, I think it's got to. I think it's inevitable that it will have to. Ed will come under greater pressure around the cabinet table to address this question in terms of energy supply. We all want a greener economy, right? I've got kids, I want them to grow up in a clean world. Nobody's naive about the fact that we need to address fossil fuels and decarbonise our economy. But you can't decarbonise by deindustrialising. The reality is we have to have a plan that enables confidence to be built in our manufacturing sectors in particular. And energy is a key part of that. So we've got renewable energies. If you look at Scotland, in Scotland, over 90% of all energy supplied at any one time will come from renewables. But their energy costs are the highest in the UK. So how do you square the circle between the price of gas, which is a backstop, but sets the price of electricity? How do we disconnect that? And that's a question for all of us. It's not just a question for the UK. It's a bigger question than that. But governments have intervened elsewhere, and we need the UK government to intervene here in a similar way to ensure that we're competitive. Because if we're not competitive, then we're not going to attract the OEMs that give us the volume, that support the supply chain, that enable the batteries to be developed, and the rest of it. Yeah. So it's a coordinated strategy, but it needs a plan.
Anyone else with a view on energy? Katherine?
Well, it's really good the government has listened. I remember whenever I talk to ministers about industrial strategy, they say the two things that business always say is the energy costs and then skills. So they definitely listened. You can see this big announcement yesterday. I know there's a consultation now, and yeah, you're right, Steve, that there's a couple of years until it becomes a reality. And the 7,000 companies, what's going to happen to the 7,001 company who's not eligible? So a lot of consultation to happen. But I suppose the answer, from my organisation's perspective, it is all about technology. So my organisation can help the automotive sector maybe learn from some of the other sectors that Steve's just mentioned, offshore renewable, hydrogen ideas and other uses of clean energy. We've also just launched a cross-Catapult programme recently on measuring emissions, which you may think, gosh, surely manufacturers know how to do that, but actually carbon accounting is an important thing. So there are methods and things we can do. And forgive me, guys, I'm from business myself previously, but I know there's so much more business can do if you work collaboratively, and that's what my organisation, the universities we partner with. I mean, the Warwick Manufacturing Group CEO is here today. Automotive and helping automotive improve their technology and innovation is one of the ways we can move forward. I do appreciate, though, we need companies to continue and thrive and sustain. We also need them to have the cash available to do that all-important R&D activity, which is what then keeps the manufacturing in the UK, and that's my mission.
Anyone else with a thought on energy? Sam?
So I would just say, I completely hear the points made. I think fundamentally we were and are bottom of the European league table, the global league table. Our electricity costs are 160 quid per megawatt hour. The intervention that was announced yesterday, and it has been an exacting process within government to get to a positive result that I think is a really important one that the cabinet definitely backs. gets it down to about 120 quid per megawatt hour. So it is like a significant reduction, and it gets it to sort of middle of the pack in terms of Europe. But I mean, there are still people, you know, ultimately Texas is like 50 quid per megawatt hour. You know, in the global sort of scheme of things, there's still some real competitive challenges. But we have got to get sort of back in the game on that one. And also, there's been some, you know, complex sort of thinking through of how that can be done without putting, you know, more onus on the taxpayer in how it is done.
We had a mention of skills. We should talk about skills before we finish. Phil, from your perspective, the skills side of this, in terms of what is proposed and in terms of actually the problem that it is seeking to address.
So I think the apprentice levy we have used effectively in our business building trucks, and our apprentices do a great job. However, as we transition the product to decarbonise the product, whether that goes electric, hydrogen, somewhere in between, efficient diesel, there's a combination of all of the above is likely to be what is required in the trucking industry to meet the user cases. So how we, it was interesting to hear Adrian say earlier about the point at which Aston might want to flip between combustion and electrification. We need to take people through on a journey that's going to be able to be a super flexible factory that can put in whatever our customer needs for their duty cycle to move those goods that they need to do. And we need to bring our workforce with that. We've been manufacturing trucks up in Lancashire for kind of 130 years or so, and we have some long-standing employees, and we need to take them on that journey that how you assemble that product and how you test and validate that product from a mechanical through to electrical to electronic, cyber secure, and now checking everything else that you'd need to make sure those systems work on those trucks. We will bring those employees with us, and I recognise that there is now some available funding, I think, in the package that says we can use towards retraining existing, and that's really important for us.
Mick, skills?
Yeah, this is an interesting one and something that I'm quite passionate about. We often turn to government and think of government as the responsibility for this endeavour. Now, absolutely, they are there to create the talent pool from schools and universities, etc., etc. But I have to say, the automotive industry needs to do a better job at highlighting the career opportunities. It's not just about working on the production line, important though that is. I don't want to take your job, absolutely not, because you've been doing it for 15 years now. But I'm going to ask for some audience participation.
Wow.
How many people are STEM ambassadors? Put your hand up, please.
Not many.
So that really answers my question. And when I say that we think about this as being a government endeavour, we collectively in this room need to spark young people's interest. And there are several key stages at doing this. That is your GCSE selection. Okay, I remember those days, not having a clue what I was going to do. And here I am sitting on this stage. I shan't tell you what I chose, by the way. Apprenticeship selection, university selection, and post-uni application. We have got to do a better job in articulating some of the skills that we need. AI experts. We need chemists. We need tariff and tax experts. The list goes on. We've got to do that better job, and we've got to do it in a way that, excuse me for my fellow panellists, but we are of a certain heritage. And we have got to communicate this opportunity through channels that we have not typically used. TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, etc., etc. So next year, when we're back here, I'll be asking the same question, who are STEM ambassadors? And I would ask that you go through the SMMT and inquire about how you do that. And we need to think about a carrot and stick approach for being a STEM ambassador.
It's so interesting about the young generation. I wrote a book a year or so ago about the 1970s. I had a rather miserable upbringing in the 1970s, and there was a book about Britain in the 70s and my upbringing. And I was telling my daughter, who was then probably about 17 or so, I was driving her back from school. She was in the back reading a book, and I said I was going on about the awfulness of Daddy's youth, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And she wasn't really listening, but I said, when Daddy was young, we didn't even have a car. And she looked up from her book and said, oh, when were they invented? You thought, there really is quite a cut-off point, actually. And they really they look at, because they look at industries so differently to the way that we would have done, certainly growing up in the 70s. I did, and factories and all the rest of it. And you kind of got this, and exactly the list that you've just made of the things that the industry needs. I don't think people of my daughter's generation properly understand yet that those careers are in this business. And that, Steve, that's the challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree completely with what's just been said there about the opportunities that are there across the sector. It's a fantastic sector to work in. It's an incredibly innovative sector. Manufacturing is not what it was 20 years ago, let alone 50 years ago. And telling parents that is an important thing, because parents are steering their children and they don't want them necessarily to take a manufacturing or an engineering footprint forward. And that's something that we need to address. We've got two groups of workers, actually. We've got the skills that we need for the future, about how we develop mobility and digital skills and digital management systems and all of those things that we all know about. But we've also got an existing workforce that we need to transition. And we need to reskill and upskill and give them the ability to be able to play a full role in the industry of the future. I mean, we've got a supply chain which is producing a lot of stuff right now, many sitting in this room, that won't be used in an electric vehicle, right? How do we transition a supply chain that's producing parts that are not in an EV? Like, how do we carry them with us? How do we make sure that we are producing them? How do we have a magnet? What's our magnet strategy? What's our inverter strategy? These are all strategies that are key to us actually as an economy, not just this sector, but a wider economy as well. And we need to attract the talent to come into the engineering sector in order to be at the forefront of it. Whether that's the chemistries of batteries and future chemistry and all that, or whether it's the physics or, there's a whole array of skills out there that are required in the industry, but it's also a really knowledgeable, experienced workforce that we need to carry with us.
Katherine.
And they're really frightened.
Well, as well as publishing industrial strategy yesterday, it was also Women in Engineering Day. So I'm certainly doing all I can to ensure that the whole gender diversity opportunities are considered. But I've got another story to add to yours, Justin.
Yeah.
A factory I know quite well, they had to hire in a whole load of new people to help move the autonomous machinery around for part of the production line. And the people they hired were gamers, because they use the gaming, technology, and they're the good ones. And you're right, it's mathematicians, it's chemists, it's people that we didn't know we needed to have in our advanced manufacturing sector. One of the things our organisation has done a lot of work on is skills foresighting, because of course technology foresighting is a key part of an engineered technology job, but also skills foresighting. How can we find out what are the skills that are needed for the future economy that there's in part of our sector? So we've done a lot of work on electrification skills, for example. So we're endeavouring to help with that. That's another part of what we're wanting to deliver to help SAM's objectives.
This has been a brilliant discussion. Thank you so much, all of you, for taking part. A round of applause, please, for our panellists.